So welcome back to the Purpose Over Profit podcast. Delighted this week to welcome Justina Murray from Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs. We've been speaking a little bit off of camera there, or off of going live on the podcast, just about how naive, I guess, and maybe ignorant Chris and I are to this subject, and largely because of how we've been brought up, not through our choice, just by the luck of the draw in terms of where we're landed. But really excited, I guess, to explore this issue with you, to highlight it, because I think it's something that Chris and I see on the periphery, that it's such a big issue, and we want to be first and foremost more informed about it, and see how we can help and share with our listeners as well. So I guess first and foremost, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Good stuff. And I guess just starting with kind of how I've framed that, are you able to just touch on how big a problem is alcohol abuse, drug abuse in Scotland specifically, which is, I guess, you're CEO of that organisation that is right in the mix of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody listening to this that Scotland has got huge issues with both alcohol and drug use. But we don't really get involved supporting families around use of substances. It's more where there's harm. So we know that lots of people use alcohol in Scotland, lots of people use drugs in Scotland, and we're not really making a judgment on that at all. It's more, where it begins to harm others that are around you that we would get involved. And you were saying there, you've not been personally affected. And I think it's one of the most interesting things about talking about alcohol and drugs and families in Scotland is that it's hidden and not hidden. So we would always say, most families are hidden. We know we are not in contact with most families who are harmed. There's so many things that are getting in the way of them coming forward for support or us reaching them for support. And we'll maybe go on to talk about some of those reasons. But also we can see the harm is everywhere, can't we? I mean, it would be an unusual person in Scotland who's never seen anybody under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or has got nobody in their network who's harmed by somebody else's alcohol or drug use. So it's kind of everywhere and nowhere. It's hidden and it's visible. It's just a kind of contradiction, I think.
I think that's an important piece. Is like, you're right, because when you consider the context of what that abuse is to a point, or what you do, if you consider when you've been out on nights out, or you've been away with people or anything like that, it becomes quite an unusually accepted thing that people sometimes do. I mean, alcohol obviously is a drug in itself, and a drink drug that's legal, but then other drugs become available and other people partake in them, whether it's not cocaine or cannabis or whatever else, and it becomes socially accepted within certain groups all of a sudden. But then when you step out of that circle back to your normal life, it's not as accepted. So yeah, you're right, actually, it's maybe not on the periphery of your of what your understanding can be of drug use, but then actually on a night out it can be, which is a bit bizarre.
Yeah, I think we just need to have more conversations like this in the open, conversations about where are alcohol and drugs in our life. There's nothing like working for an alcohol and drug charity to suddenly make you very aware of, well, particularly if I think about myself and my drinking, I can think about myself in the past. I often bought alcohol as gifts for people, like, my team members and other jobs. I would drink at a work event. Myself and some former colleagues from local government in the past were talking about, the provost drinks trolley, the provost's, drinks cabinet, all these kind of things that were just, they're just like part of this kind of culture. And I think when you work for a charity like Scottish Families, it does make you suddenly think, oh my goodness, and it's shone a bit of a light with Boris and the whole Partygate thing. Maybe alcohol in workplaces, there's not a great combination. So like, for example, at Scottish Families, we're an alcohol-free workplace, which also means alcohol-free Christmas events. So we have to be maybe a wee bit more creative than other people about how to celebrate Christmas, because so many people just have alcohol as that go-to place. We'll have a drink and then we'll have a good time. Whereas we're like, well, actually, we can have a good time without alcohol, and here's some great ways we're gonna do that. So it's really been a lot of learning, not just for me, but for others in the team as well. We're not an abstinence-based charity, but it definitely makes you more mindful about the impact of alcohol and drugs in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely see the conflict there. And if you were to have, alcohol, Christmas celebrations, like there is a conflict there. I want to come back to something that you said to start off with, though. I guess you're not against, it's not abstinence, it's not, teetotal alcohol. It's not completely, sobriety. And similarly with drugs, it's where that has an impact on families. So I guess something I'm keen to understand is where do you see the line, if there is a line indeed, between alcohol use, drug use, and where that starts to have an impact on family life? Because I guess I'm leading that question because I guess isn't there always an impact, even if it's not direct or not in the way that we would think is extreme? There's always an impact.
Well, there's been some really interesting research with children, some of which was carried out in Scotland through the Children's Parliament with Alcohol Focus Scotland. And children were talking about the fact that alcohol is absolutely everywhere, from when they open the fridge to get their milk out for their cereal in the morning, you've got, mummy's wine in the fridge door, to, branding and sports gear. It's been well reported about all the sponsorship, alcohol sponsorship, for example, in rugby. Lots and lots of mentions of alcohol, and it's just, absolutely everywhere. And if we think about, I'm in my early 50s now, and if I compare like life now compared to when I was growing up, we didn't have like alcohol at kids' parties, for example. You didn't get alcohol at the cinema, you wouldn't get alcohol in a bookshop, but all of these things are now quite routine. And so there's been this kind of normalization of alcohol use in society. So I think it's true, there's a very fine line between use and harm. And I think if we're listening to children, they don't really differentiate. So some other research called Like Sugar for Adults was carried out also by Alcohol Focus with the Institute for Alcohol Studies at UK level. And they found that children didn't really differentiate between when their parents were tipsy or drunk. They just know they're under the influence. So I think, again, I'm a mum of teenagers. That makes you really quite mindful again about, what your children are seeing compared to what you think you are, how you think you're presenting. But there's not like a definite line between alcohol use and alcohol harm. And one of the things I think that was most distressing about the pandemic was the amount of families where alcohol and drug use then did slip into alcohol and drug harm. So if I give some examples of that, alcohol and drug use might have been happening outside the home, or when the family was outside the home and suddenly it's moved into the home, the rest of the family are in the home. And also all of the things that family members might have used to kind of keep themselves well, going to work, going to college, meeting your pal for a coffee, going to the gym, going for a swim, none of that was there. And so I think we saw many more families getting drawn into alcohol and drug harm, where before it had been use that maybe didn't affect them in such a significant way.
I think that's a really interesting point, because this is one of the points I wanted to discuss. A strategy impact report, which is quite startling when you see it in black and white, how it said, like, I think there was a 122% increase on the concerns of alcohol, the diazepam, 120% increase, and 42% increase in cocaine, and the fact that it became more accepted in the home. And like, I think when you mentioned harm as well, and in my social circle, there is drugs available, there's people taking drugs as well. I know people that went from being in a lockdown situation where it was a very occasional thing, but it became it's all of a sudden became a little bit habitual, when they kind of they need it to kind of do their day-to-day life, but it becomes at the weekend, it's a way to elevate and get rid of the stress. Whereas maybe they'd have a couple of drinks, but then they see it as once they've had a couple of drinks, they feel a bit low, so they need a pick-me-up as well. And is that a way where you're talking about maybe that grey area where you start to move into the harm element if it becomes habitual and goes into the home?
And I think lockdown definitely brought complete changes in all of our living patterns, didn't it? So instead of, some people were furloughed, so they weren't working at all. People had added pressures in the home, whether it's homeschooling or, just being concerned about relatives who they couldn't see. And also working from home is incredibly stressful for a lot of people. And so, we saw that situation where people who were maybe sort of recreationally using alcohol or drugs at the end of a workday or on a weekend, suddenly that all just gets a little bit muddy, because like, when does your workday begin and end? When does your weekend begin and end? And, there was lots of stuff on social media, wasn't there, about like, drink your way through homeschooling, it's the only way to do it. And, a kind of comedy element. But I suppose what we were seeing at our end wasn't all that funny, because, you then did have, again, people moving into that alcohol and drug harm, where previously there'd been kind of use that was well managed and didn't really impact on others. So And also as lockdown sort of shifted and you had these times where people were maybe getting out and about more or going back to the office, you know, there was more and more people concerned about their own alcohol and drug use all of a sudden, because they're like, how am I going to actually get up and go to the office? Because I've basically been doing like holiday drinking now for like a year and a half. So how do you get back into that routine? So I know that alcohol and drug support services have definitely seen that as we've moved kind of through the pandemic and back to a more sort of out and about life.
How involved were you? I mean, thinking back to the first lockdown, I remember my next door neighbour at the time, their parents had a small off licence, which went on the road, effectively doing ferry trips around and done a lot of very good business over that time. And I guess I'm thinking, you know, I guess charity like yourself, the decision to have that as a, you know, everywhere else is shut down, everyone's working from home, and yet that was deemed as an essential like item almost for us to live. Like, how involved, I guess, were you at that time? How involved could you be in terms of lobbying Parliament and government to, you know, to prevent that? Because we're now on the other side of it. We can't go back and change that. But I guess crucially, that has been the catalyst for allowing a lot of the habitual negative behaviour to kind of flow through for the last year and a half.
Well, there was a very interesting, I think it was actually a parliamentary question that was asked about relaxing the licensing laws around shop bought alcohol, around the poor NHS staff who couldn't, you know, they had a kind of protected shopping hour from 9 till 10, so they couldn't buy their much needed alcohol. And I just thought that was so interesting that that got any media mileage at all, and never mind political mileage, because actually that wasn't what like the medical unions were talking about at the time. They were, you know, terrified for their staff. You know, staff were like stressed out of their minds, you know, not be able to access PPE. You know, that was their issue. You know, we weren't aware of any medical staff who were saying, oh, what a pain, I can't get that bottle of Chardonnay at 9 o'clock in the morning, you know. So I think there's a lot of lobbying by the alcohol industry that we never see, but then it appears through things like, you know, parliamentary questions or things that look quite objective and innocent. So, I mean, we are part of a coalition or an alliance of organisations who, you know, can understand that alcohol does cause harm, and, you know, we need to keep pushing on price and marketing and availability, because all of these things are evidence-based interventions to reduce alcohol harm. So, yeah, so I mean, the alcohol industry is clever. You know, they're not always visible in what they're doing, but they're definitely always busy in the background.
Yeah, and listen, in contrast, the point that you made, and I wrote just a few of those areas where you're like, you know, I would look at, you know, say the 80s, I was born in the 80s, but I like growing up, it felt like there was house parties all the time that my parents were at. But I guess the access to alcohol in the public, it is everywhere now. And I'm like, you're right. You know, maybe smoking stopped and you weren't advertising that. And actually just alcohol's taken its place. And of course, there's so much more in our face now, advertising on YouTube and, you know, smart TVs and phones and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's in the cinema. It's everywhere we go, we can access it. So in contrast to the lobbying, the maybe piecemeal lobbying in government, actually on a ground level, it's everywhere in front of us.
Yeah, you know, and there's a kind of
we can get it.
Yeah, there's a kind of expectation as well. So, you know, we saw a communication. In fact, it came through a survey response from our alcohol action group, and this family member said, you know, she was wanting to organise a birthday party for herself. She wanted it to be alcohol free because of her own experience. And actually lots of the people who were so-called her friends were like, oh, you know what, we're going to give that a body swerve, because they couldn't actually imagine having a good time. So we've kind of embedded it so much in our culture that there's an expectation that alcohol should be everywhere and that we should have access to it at all times. So if we think about the alcohol on trains issue, which I know has been back in the media this week, and during the pandemic, alcohol was banned on trains, and the Scottish Government have said they've not yet made a decision on reintroducing it. But like, why would you have alcohol on the train? It doesn't seem to make any sense at all. I live in Ayrshire, and so I'm travelling up and down to Glasgow, you know, for work or for leisure at the weekends. And it is so interesting, like on a Saturday morning, you get pretty much any train out of Ayrshire around, you know, mid-morning, and there'll be a lot of people drinking on the train for what is not even an hour-long journey to go up to Glasgow, where they are, drinking is the main thing they're going for, a bit of shopping, a bit of lunch, a bit of drink, and so it just seems there's a culture again that didn't used to exist. The train where there used to be drinking, like I used to live in Glasgow and worked in Stirling, and you did not want to get that 5:30 train on a Friday night back to Glasgow with the oil rig workers who were just really decompressing after all that time in their alcohol-free rigs. It was a pretty messy train journey every week, but that was kind of very unusual. Whereas now that would be routine, and men and women, people of all ages. This is not about young men. It's about just a sort of community attitude that let's get tanked on the train because that's just what you do now. It's really been probably quite a quick transition in society, but quite a slow thing to turn around again, I think.
I think actually, do you know what, you mentioned culture there, and I think that we sometimes forget how far Scotland has come, because obviously Scotland were really pushing the minimum pricing for alcohol as well. And I was down in Liverpool for my 40th way back in November, and I went to a Liverpool match, my wife as well. And in Scotland, you forget that you can't drink in the streets. There's a lot. You forget there's no alcohol in the stadium as well at these grounds, unless it's like a rugby match. It's slightly different. So when my wife and I get dropped off in the coach, it was hospitality, we get dropped off. There was a petrol garage. We went to go and get some chewing gum and something else. I think it was water actually. And in the street, everyone's standing drinking. Absolutely everyone. You get in the stadium, everyone's drinking. You walk by, there's betting shops. I mean, betting is rife as well. There's betting, there's alcohol, there's Carlsberg. And then you're sitting beside people and they're drinking beside you. You're not supposed to take the alcohol in. And there's a gentleman that was in the wrong end. He thought that his team were playing Arsenal. He was absolutely obliterated, and he was getting the mickey taken out of him, and he had bottles in his jacket. He must have been about 60 or 70, and I'm thinking that culturally that's become accepted and people laugh it off, and he never even get escorted out to premises. So I think in Scotland we sometimes are quite hard on ourselves. We have come quite far compared to, you mentioned like obviously Partygate and Boris Johnson, the way that's kind of constructed itself. But I kind of want to go back to the misuse in the home, and like you mentioned about the children aspect, they don't know whether or not you're tipsy or drunk. And how's that seen? Like obviously we've talked about alcohol. Alcohol seems to be the one thing that culturally we accept, but what about drugs in the home as well? How do children perceive that in the home? If do they catch on to that quite early, how their parents behave?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, and we have focused a lot on alcohol in the conversation so far, and I think the Scottish Government, in terms of their drug policy, have focused very much on kind of opiates, heroin and so on. But actually, we're about to embark, or early stages of embarking on a new project all about cocaine, just for the very point that you're mentioning there, that, cocaine is something that has kind of massively increased in terms of harms over recent years. And some of the family support groups that we support, they've gone entirely from family members who are concerned about their loved ones' opiate use to entirely being made up of family members concerned about their loved ones' cocaine use. And the Sunday Post did a report a couple of weeks ago about cocaine and football fans, not cocaine and football players, but football fans, and just that in the ground you're getting now this culture of kind of alcohol plus cocaine, and it's a very kind of tanked up atmosphere just at the time you're trying to encourage more women to go to football, more children, more kind of family friendly atmosphere. So we're quite interested on shining a light on that, like what exactly is going on with cocaine, because it's one of those things that people are like, oh, it's fine, it's a party, it's just parties, it's just at the weekends. And actually the more people you talk to, that's not true. It's absolutely everywhere. So that will be some of the things we're going to be finding out, like what are children, young people seeing in the home around cocaine. It's not something that we have investigated so far. We know that the family members coming forward are talking about cocaine harm, but in terms of what their children are seeing and hearing, I think that will be really interesting. I know from some of the local research work we've done previously, there was a conversation where somebody was talking about young people getting really preached at in terms of their drinking. And the young people were thinking, well, hang on a minute, our parents are all using cocaine every weekend. So really, who are they to be judging us for our substance use? So and then also young people are quite relaxed about cannabis use, for example. It's being portrayed as a very harmless drug, but again, any drug can cause, can cause harm, which not to say always does, but it can do. So I think all of these things are worth exploring. You know, these other drugs that seem to be much more socially acceptable, you know, they're not seen as a problem because so much of the focus has been on drug deaths and on sort of opiate use, and a group of sort of older drug users who have, you know, are very much represented or overrepresented in those statistics. And meanwhile, we are seeing different trends coming through in the drug deaths as well. You know, cocaine is becoming more and more prevalent, for example, in the drug death statistics, but we need to be looking at that now, not waiting until, you know, 10 years down the line when we're all going, oh, isn't it terrible, like all those cocaine deaths. Like, we can see that happening now, and that trend is happening now. So one of my colleagues talks about what's coming over the hill, but it's not even coming over the hill, it's like here already. So definitely worth exploring.
And there's something in that you touched on. I mean, I was looking into like what stats could I see around it, and a lot of it is deaths. Like, what can you measure about it? It feels such a challenging area to get a handle on. Where are we trending? And like, to me, deaths is the tip of the iceberg. Like, how many other, the word tertiary comes to mind, but it's not tertiary when you're talking about abuse in the household and an impact on families, kids, you know, husbands, wife, partners, girlfriends, all of that. Everyone else that's affected as a result of it beyond the death. Obviously, when a death happens, that is as tragic as it can get. But actually, there's a whole host of like other issues that will be amplified. I don't know how many. I'd imagine at least 10 times fold what we're seeing when we're reporting a death. But the death rates look like they've been declining. That, I think it was a 15-16 paper, which was kind of one of the bigger ones that I'd seen, looked like it's been declining, you know, kind of from late 80s. But it doesn't feel that way. I mean, I'm not close to it, but like, what's your feeling on?
I was going to just jump in there to say something as well, because I guess, because I've got experience with friends and people else that have done this kind of stuff, and they talk around depression, anxiety, paranoia, all this kind of stuff. But then whenever they go to seek support, or if they go to the GPs for depression, they won't be honest, because again, there's that stigma and that worry about it as well. So I'm sorry to jump in there. That's just because from personal experience, I know that that's what people sometimes find. I don't know if that's relevant or.
You've brought up probably about 100 relevant issues there in those two inputs. So yeah, I mean, looking at the death, first of all, I mean, it is the ultimate failure of all of us, isn't it? When somebody dies through drugs or alcohol, it's a totally preventable death. And, you know, I am very frustrated that the political and media focus around alcohol and drugs is so often around deaths. And, you know, we do so much it's so important that we support families who are bereaved and we recognise families, but also most families will have spent years and years and years supporting their loved one, crying out for help, trying to access services, being judged, being ignored. And then when the person dies, we're a bit like, oh, that's a shame. You know, and it's a kind of, it's what there's kind of not a lot of areas where people feel comfortable talking about families, but often when you say, well, I work around, you know, alcohol, drugs and families, people will very quickly go to bereaved families, and that's a kind of safe space where they understand that's one of the harms. But we did a project a few years ago called Behind the Numbers, where we were trying to say, this is terrible, the statistics are awful, and every one of those numbers is a person, but here's all of these other families who are desperately trying to keep their loved ones alive. We need to say, listen to what they are saying. They're telling us about all kinds of things that need to be improved that are going to reduce the number of people dying. So that is an ongoing frustration. The issue about mental health and people coming forward with mental health concerns is really interesting, because people talk about the fact that, you know, there's been so much progress around mental health and stigma. You know, it's okay not to be okay. We can talk about our mental health. You know, people aren't going to judge you in the same way. And there's been huge investment as well in campaigns like See Me, which are, you know, so evidence-based, and they're really, really robust in terms of like tackling understanding about mental health. But you move then to alcohol and drugs, and as you say, people are terrified to talk about it, you know. So most of the families who come to us for support have never talked to anybody about what's going on. They don't even always speak to, you know, their most immediate family members. They try and manage it all themselves and kind of keep a lid on it. And so when family members contact us, they're normally looking for support for their loved one in the first instance. But then when we say, how are you? They're like, what do you mean, how am I? I'm not even part of this story. And then you get this outpouring, of course, about everything that they've been dealing with. It's just so hidden. And I think the fact that people are coming forward with mental health symptoms or mental health conditions, but not talking about, substance use behind that, means it's much harder for the clinicians to actually understand, like, how could we properly help this person. But also when people, ironically enough, when people do come forward and they say, well, actually, I've got issues with substances and I've got mental health concerns, the response is not great, because you're told by mental health services, well, we can't deal with you because you're under the influence, so you need to go and get your substance use fixed first. And then you go to substance use services and they say, well, actually, you seem to have a mental health condition, so you really need to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And so people are kind of like, pushed around backwards and forwards between the two services. And so who's in the middle of that? The family's in the middle, and the family ends up trying to be like the caseworker and the case manager and the advocate and, the navigator and the signposter. And, they're the ones that are left in the middle trying to hold it all. So there are so many strategies and policies and, about how we need to deal with substance use and mental health together. But actually on the ground, that's just not the reality just now.
What do you think's the biggest thing that we could be doing in that space that we're not, or you're kind of being prevented from doing?
I think we talk all the time, we bandy these words around about like holistic care and being trauma informed and, being person-centered. And those are great ambitions. But when you talk to families on the ground, it's just like, they're just words. This is not the experience that people have when they reach out for support from a lot of treatment services. They're not seen in a holistic way. They're very much seen in this kind of compartmentalized way. Services talk about being trauma informed, but actually, we get a lot of service generated trauma as well. It can be really traumatic trying to get help for alcohol or drug use or for your experience as a family member. And so I think just seeing people in the round, seeing the whole family, making sure the whole family's needs are met, these are really, really important things to put into practice. And again, we're writing down a lot of the right stuff on paper. We have got good strategies, we've got good policies in Scotland. And I think it's a really important difference between the kind of Scottish policy landscape and what's happening in England, is that in Scotland, alcohol and drugs policy, it sits within public health. We see it as a public health issue. In England, it sits within justice. It's seen as a kind of crime and justice issue. So I think we should be grateful for that in Scotland. But actually, that public health framework doesn't seem to have dripped completely through practice. So, yes, our services are based within a public health services, but they're not treating people always in a public health way. And we're still treating people in quite a punitive way, as if they're to blame or their families are to blame. They've done something wrong. If they could just pull themselves together, it would all be all right. And I think we need to have more connection between what the good things that we write in our policies and our strategies and what families and individuals are actually experiencing on the ground.
I think that's really interesting, because I mentioned this to Darren. My wife is a nurse and she loves to read. So she mentioned a book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, by Gabrielle Matty, that she is reading just now. And he talks around about understanding the trauma. It's not all about addiction and all this kind of stuff, and digging deep to understand it instead of handing out pills. But just listening to you there, that kind of changed my perception of what I was going to say, because you've actually mentioned it's the family in the middle. It's the family in the middle that you mentioned, the navigators, the support systems and all this kind of stuff, because as much as you want to help and support that individual, you've got to look at that wider network that's getting damaged out as well, I guess. Because Darren and I know about the circle of influence, who you can influence, who you can support. But I guess if that's getting barraged with all sorts of stuff and really damaged, then you're going to sometimes cripple a family if you don't give them the overall support. And is that where your strengths and your roles and your charity lies, really getting in amongst it and helping that family as much as possible?
Well, nobody ever has the family at the centre. So, we work with alcohol and drug services all of the time, and everyone is fixated on the individual using the substances and, how they can get support, what's needed to support them. And the family is just some kind of, white noise in the background that's a bit of a pain, actually, because they're calling you to account and they're trying to come to appointments. And, we start always with the family at the centre, and we see the family as an asset, as a strength. You know, if families are supported in their own right, they can, you know, support their loved one better. But also, in some cases, it might be about stepping back from their loved one a little bit. You know, you can't magic somebody into recovery. You can't just make somebody recover, you know, but you can do a lot to help and support that to happen. But sometimes for family members, the work we do with them is just learning actually to take that step back, to think about themselves, to look after themselves, and to change the way that they're engaging with their loved one. So whole families can be very much focused on the individual using substances. So that person very much controls everything that's going on in the family, all the conversations. There, you know, there's an impact on the financial side of the family, on kind of family events, you know, and so everything is very much kind of circling around this individual all of the time. And the work we do with families just kind of changes that dynamic, you know, sort of saying to family members, well, you know, don't choose when your loved one comes in from the pub to talk about their drinking. Maybe pick a time where you've had a really nice Sunday lunch and they've not had a drink, and you can say, that was just so nice today. Let's do that next Sunday as well. And you're kind of rewarding positive non-substance using behaviour without having a total rammy about their substance using behaviour. So suddenly the person is not the focus of every conversation. Every conversation is not an argument. And the fact we might say to the family member, well, go and meet your pal for a coffee today. You know, you don't need to be at home every minute of the day being part of that drama. And so when family members learn to sort of remove themselves and not always engage in the drama, just that whole family dynamic changes, and you do get more of a focus on the whole family rather than everything kind of spiraling around this one person who's using substances in the middle.
Something, I guess, so that I think that sounds like how you've described it there, like putting the focus on the family, making it, you know, giving some coping strategies to manage the conflict, I guess, there that is inevitably going to come, and which is almost like that is the natural response to it, because that's where the trigger is when someone's come home, either, you know, if they're drunk or if they've, you know, you can see they're clearly on drugs. That's going to be where it kicks off. So where I'm interested in is also from a kid's point of view. So the children are, you know, they've not asked to be born into that. They've had no choice in it whatsoever. You could argue, you know, the partner maybe does to some extent. From a children's point of view or a kid's point of view, how can you support them, or how do you support them? Because it feels like a really difficult one to be able to step in and even just see that's needing that's the kids are needing support.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to remember that families do come in all shapes and sizes, and we support a lot of families where there's not children in the family. You know, it might be a parent who's concerned about their child who's using alcohol or drugs, but their child's actually 40 or 50, you know, so it's sort of concern about adult children. You know, there's lots and lots of family types who are affected by alcohol and drugs. But where there are children, of course, they're impacted, and, you know, it's often not recognised. So I think there'll be some families where the children are very much on the radar of support, particularly where there's opiate use. There might be, you know, there's a kind of obvious presenting need, the way that maybe the children appear at school or nursery or don't appear at school or nursery. And so I think families in that situation are more likely to be on the radar of support. I think the families and the children rather who are more hidden will be where there's alcohol harm, where there's harm through other drugs, and actually the outward presentation of the family is fully functioning. You know, the children, young people may be very high performing at school. You know, the parent may be very well presented, and actually it can be often complete chance that we find out where that's the situation and that help can be offered to families. So I think I'm going back to that point that so many children and families are hidden from view. And the more we have this conversation about the fact that it's okay actually to reach out for help, you know, so to say to children, it's okay to speak to somebody at school, you know, and you know they're going to get a good response. So it's on us to make sure that teachers are well informed about how children might present. So they may present with what would be classed by a school as like bad behavior, or, you know, you just see this all of the time, that although we're taught that, you know, all behavior is communication, all communication is behavior. Can't quite remember which way that goes, but it's not the way that children are always treated at school. You know, it's very much kind of good or bad behavior. You either fit in or you don't fit in. And I think we need to, you know, again, we talk about being trauma informed, but that is how children may display that trauma, is by what looks like disruptive behavior, or, you know, or just actually closing in on themselves and being uncommunicative. So we need to kind of make sure that children have trusted adults in their life, where they can speak openly, and that where there's often other family members, such as, you know, maybe if you've got a parent using substances, there's often a granny or a granddad or an auntie around who's a really great support, that they know they can get support in their own right as well, and that will also help the children in the family. So we did a project last year called Ask the Family, and we said to people, you know, how many people do you think are affected in your family by this one person's alcohol or drug use? And the average figure was 11. So for every person using substances, you know, when they counted them all up, and there was every family relationship, you know, they ticked all these different relationships, including, you know, blood relatives and also friends and neighbours and work colleagues, you know, all of this social network who were affected. And we said, well, add all of those up. And the average number was 11. And even we were a bit blown away by that, because we've traditionally talked about the power of 5. So if you support a family member, that has a roll-on benefit to 5 other people in the family. And to be very scientific about it, we don't even know where that figure came from. It's just a kind of power of 5 thing that we say. So, you know, we were surprised by that figure of 11, but actually it makes sense when you think about everybody who's around an individual and how far that harm reaches. And yet again, all of the focus of services is on the person using the substances, and we don't really think about all of these other people around them.
I think there's something in there which is fantastic. Just listening to it, so there's 2 facts I want to quickly pick up. The first is the empowerment piece. It sounds like you're empowering families, but you're also trying to empower teachers in schools as well to understand the signs. Because I mean, Darren and I, probably we're all the same, thinking back to our own educational background. I mean, when I was at school, people were smoking cannabis and all this kind of stuff. And if you were caught with it, you're disciplined, suspended, probably expelled. But there was people acting out at that point as well. I guess acting out back then is probably what it was the same now, but we've now probably hopefully got a better support network in place. So I was going to ask you just quickly around what support network you've got for the schools, but obviously I want to touch upon the empowerment of families as well and come back to that if that's okay.
Yeah, well, we generally support adult family members, so we don't do a lot of work with younger people. We have got one project in East and West Dunbartonshire which works with 12 to 26-year-olds, and that's called Roots. And most of the young people we work with are 12 to 16-year-olds within that. And we have learned so much about working with our Roots young people, not least that a lot of them weren't really getting any support from anywhere else. They weren't really engaging with other services. You know, they might have a social worker or, you know, a guidance teacher at school, but they're not able to give them an awful lot of support. So through Roots, we really have, it's been running for the past 3 years, and we wanted to really test out, you know, what works with that group of young people who are affected by somebody else's substance use, because we knew that there's much more support for young people who are using substances themselves. And whenever I say to people, oh, we have a young person's project, they almost instantly go to the thought of young people using alcohol and drugs. And when we say actually it's young people who are affected by other substance use, and we learned they're just so missed out, excuse me, they're just so missed out, because a lot of I'm just going to get a drink of water. You could tell I've been talking all day. So that group of young people are just so missed out, because a lot of the focus on children is on younger children, you know, the pre-5s at the primary age, and then you get to teenage years and you're kind of left to your own devices. So what we learned from working with our Roots young people was about, they don't want anything that looks like a support group. It's not about sitting at like having a crying and talking and sharing your feelings. You know, what really works for them is an activity-based program, a lot of one-to-one support, you know, building really trusted relationships with our team. They have built tremendous friendships with each other. They just say, you know, this is a kind of group, you can go into it and you can say, my dad's just gone into rehab, my mum's just relapsed, and nobody's even going to flinch. You know, these are things you could not say in the school playground. So, you know, I think going back to, I've even forgotten the thread of your question, which is about what's going on with schools. We've had good engagement with some schools around our Roots project, and they really get it. And we've got, you know, great close working with them. But other schools have just not really engaged. They're just not, you know, these young people aren't on the radar. They think they're already getting support from somebody else, or they think they're not using substances, so they're not really worried about them. So we would love to do more work with schools. Whenever we're having conversations in local areas about what's going on, schools is always an area for development. But we also know schools have got a tremendous amount of work on their plate already, not least if we are post-pandemic. And I think whatever we do with schools, we need to bring in the resource. We need to provide the help. We need to give them the headspace. You know, we need to really be seen as an ally and a help to what they're doing, not as saying teachers need to do this and teachers need to learn that, and, you know, putting yet more responsibilities on them. So, and what was your second question again? It was schools and...
That's okay. I was going to say, Darren, do you want to jump in with a question, actually?
Well, no, that's all I was going to build on. That was, like, you mentioned that, like, something earlier around, we're discussing what's hidden. It's like, we don't talk about, you know, alcohol use. We don't talk about, you know, substance abuse, because it's the hidden stuff. It's the stuff that we think is presented on the outside, okay, but actually it's behind closed doors where the issue presents itself. And I really like the idea of that Roots program, getting kids into a space, 12 to 16-year-olds or 12-year-olds plus, where you're almost giving them an outlet to talk about it and to normalize that behavior of talking about it, which obviously goes on to adulthood, and it's part of how you end up resolving an issue, or at least playing a part of saying, look, more people are talking about this collectively. So I wanted to just highlight that, because it, you know, it feels like that's very, very important. I know Chris and I are part of the MCR Pathways program in schools, which is fantastic. We've both really, really enjoyed it, and I guess there's some crossover there, that I would say, because it's, you know, it's open to everyone, and, you know, it may not be someone who's categorized or in the care system, but it is someone that's potentially on the fringes of it or has had some impact. I know certainly my mentee did, and, you know, I think it's really important to be able to give that space to communicate, I think, with young people, to normalize that that's okay, you know, because I think it's really a difficult challenge for adults changing that, you know, 30, 40 years, 50 years old. But I think having that conversation earlier, you just stand a much better chance.
I mean, I don't agree with the point about adults. I think, you know, supporting families at any stage is massively effective. And I was at a meeting the other day where there was a woman there who was in her 60s who had got support in the last few years, and her life has been transformed. So we're wishing she got that support, and that was the way the conversation went. Like when her son first started, you know, displaying concerning behaviour, he was at school and there was no support offered, and now he's in his 40s, she's in her 60s. A lot of time has passed, but definitely, you know, she's now getting the support that she needs, and her life has transformed. But I think the great thing about MCR Pathways is, again, you're building a trusted relationship with a young person. You're not judging them, you're seeing them at face value. Whereas I think, you know, a lot of children and young people, they talk about being really judged, you know, by services, by the people who are supposed to be around them and helping them. You come from that sort of family, you're just, you know, you tick all of those ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experience checklist, you're off the chart, you know, and kids are really put in a box quite early on. And I think we need to find, you know, the way that we're working with them, and MCR Pathways are working with young people, is just really seeing them with fresh eyes and at face value and in their own right. You know, they're not defined by, you know, the way that other family members are behaving or what they're doing. You know, they're really in their own right. And Chris, you had asked about empowerment. That's the point that the thread that I lost. The work we're doing with families is definitely about empowerment, because they have been very disempowered through, you know, feeling that everything's gone out of their control. Family members talk to us all of the time in really distressing terms about not wanting to live anymore. Their life isn't worth living. Their life might as well be at an end. And actually, the work we can do with them is about really taking back control of that situation and helping family members to understand that you can still recover as a family, even if your loved one doesn't recover. That's quite hard for people to get their head around, but you're not in control of that. You can't control, whether the loved one either gives up alcohol and drugs or reduces their alcohol and drug consumption. But what you can control is, how much impact that has on you and the measures you put in place to protect yourself and the rest of the family, to look after yourself, to take time for yourself. And so that is hugely, it is life-changing and transformational for families.
I think that's kind of led on to a point I was going to make as well, which is we've talked about alcohol, we've talked about drug use, we've talked about it in a kind of light way, but then you've talked about the darker side there, which is great, about people feeling suicidal, the family members. But even, I'm going to get this wrong how you say this. I asked my wife how you say it, and she said I got it wrong as well. Naloxone, how do you say this?
Naloxone.
Naloxone, there you go. She'll be laughing at that when she hears this. But would you mind explaining to our listeners what that is? Because for me, when I seen that video and I heard what it was about, it was quite, like Darren mentioned about us being in a privileged situation. I felt very privileged when I watched that video and I realised how much empowerment you give these people.
Yeah, so Naloxone is a life-saving drug. I've got mine on my work bag there in a little pouch. If you just give me 1 second.
Yeah, of course.
I know this is radio, this is podcast, and this is radio silence, but here is my little Naloxone pack that I can carry.
We will be going out on YouTube as well, so.
There you go, little promo. So Naloxone is a life-saving intervention where somebody is experiencing an opioid overdose, so for example, heroin or methadone. And Naloxone buys you time, essentially. So you can administer Naloxone, so you phone an ambulance, first of all, administer Naloxone, and that will bring the person round long enough for medical help to arrive. And we have a click and deliver service, so it's very easy for anybody now in Scotland to get Naloxone. If you just search Scottish Families Click and Deliver, it'll pop up and we'll deliver it free to your home. It just comes in a discreet little pack, so nobody needs to know what it's for. And I think, what I'm really proud of our award-winning click and deliver service is that, we recognise that family members often weren't asking for Naloxone because they had to declare themselves to like alcohol and drug treatment services. They had to go to a local pharmacy to pick it up. There's lots and lots of reasons why a family might not want to do that. But also through the National Naloxone Programme, we've been working with Scottish Drugs Forum and others for members of the public to be able to access Naloxone. So you may have seen there was taxis now that are branded with, all the kind of get your save a life branding, stop the death, save a life. And so taxi drivers, bus drivers, security guards, lots of people who might come across an overdose situation in their work, even though their work isn't actually in alcohol and drug services. So going back to empowerment, we're trying to sort of say to people that you can save a life, anyone can save a life. I now have the Nixoid form of Naloxone, which puffs up the nose. There's also a version called Pronoxad, which is injectable, which a lot of people use as well. So we offer both of those, and it's so easy to learn how to use it. Absolutely anybody can use it.
I mean, it's scary to think, I guess, carrying that around and even feeling like you needed to use that, like that, it instantly kind of, as a taxi driver or, doorman or, bus driver, or whatever, like even the thought of coming into contact with that and having to act feel like, scares the life out of me. But I think the fact that there is the option there to be able to help and facilitate that, and you are facilitating that through that service. It's like how many additional lives, I guess, that's going to be able to save as a result of that would otherwise potentially be lost. I wanted to come on to, because I don't know how much of this is related to it, but from a funding point of view, you're a fifth of, or around 20%, I think, is funded from the government. So I mean, you're a charity still. You're 80% you're relying on, I guess, donations, grants, other fundraising bodies, I guess. I guess thinking about the wider, we're obviously wanting to raise this as an issue, seeing like how we can specifically help with that. How can Joe Public, anyone I guess that's listening to this, how can they support your organisation, even whether it's from vacancies, donations, volunteering? Are you able to just talk a bit about that, and I guess the range of different support that people can be able to provide and help your charity?
Well, there's lots of ways people can get involved with Scottish Families. So there's lots of information on our website about how you could work with us, how you can fundraise with us. We're just developing a new volunteering programme actually to encourage and develop more volunteer opportunities within the organisation. But I mean, you're right in terms of the funding, that around about 20% of our funding has come from our core government grant. So I know we're very fortunate to have core funding, which we use to kind of run the organisation. And we do also get other government funding, but a lot of it's competitive. You know, we have to bid for it. We get funding from trusts and foundations, from an absolutely incredible work of our individual fundraisers. You know, if you follow us on social media, you'll see we've just had people doing the kilt walk for us. We've got people running marathons for us, doing hill walks, doing absolutely everything. And it's one of the things I feel just really humbling in my role, is that the people who will go above and beyond to raise money for us, and a lot of them have got personal experience as family members. We've not always supported all of them. Sometimes it's something that's happened in somebody's past, and they've said, you know, they wish that we were there when they were growing up, and it would have maybe resulted in different outcomes, but they then want to give back to our charity. It's really overwhelming, actually. So we do rely very much on other sources of funding. And I would say, as a chief exec, it's one of the things I find most soul destroying about my job, is constantly having to battle for funding. Probably any third sector chief exec would say that to you. I don't know anyone who's kicking back going, yes, I'm minted, I don't need to look for any more money. You know, we're always searching for money to support more families. And I think I find it so frustrating, because we have to do so much work to get people to see families, you know, as worth the investment, to stop blaming and judging families. We need to do so much work to get people to recognise that you need a lot of family support as well. You know, so we have a number of areas where we've maybe developed with one family support worker, then we've been trying to kind of grow a team. And then meanwhile, there's like 100 people working around, you know, supporting individuals using substances. And we've got our tiny number of people trying to support families. So, you know, anything that people can do to help raise funds for Scottish families is fantastic. But I think the other thing I would really say is about encouraging people to link in with us. So, you know, if you know any family members who are looking for support, who need support, have that conversation with them. You know, it can be a hard thing to talk about if somebody's not, you know, trying to keep it all secret and trying to keep it all hidden. But we really want people to know the support is out there. You get such a fantastic response from my team. I love my team. You know, they're so good at what they do. You know, just today we've been recruiting for a new post in one of our local services, and just the feedback we're getting from people who already know about the worker there, it's so lovely. They're just so complimentary and they all love her. And, you know, we just know that what we provide is fantastic. So if you come to us, you are going to get great support. And I can say that with 100% confidence.
Yeah, I think there's a big piece about that, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I wasn't thinking it when I asked the question, but around this idea of reaching out to you if you're aware of it, because I think that is a lot of it. You wouldn't know potentially that's there. You might go to a GP, and I don't know whether GPs are potentially going to, you know, help that. You'd said, you know, you get caught in this. Well, if you're on alcohol, or if you're on drugs and you've got mental health challenges, like one of them needs to be managed first, but actually they both are an issue and can cause sort of additional concerns and pressures on the family. So I think knowing that you're there is like, it's half the battle, and being able to get someone to reach out to you, knowing that there's a resource there, and it's not coming from a place of judgment or scrutiny. It's purely about trying to help you in your position and recognizing you didn't ask for this situation. So yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
And we know that most people, you know, the first formal place they will reach out beyond family and friends is their GP and, you know, other primary care services. And we have very mixed feedback on that. So we have fantastic relationships with some GPs. They refer family members in. We're always so pleased when people say, my GP has, you know, told me about you and told me to get in touch. Or also GPs can refer directly in through our website portal. So that, it's a bit mixed, because other family members say, well, I went to my GP for support and I came away being told there's nothing you can do unless your loved one wants to change, and here's some antidepressants. So there's no recognition of the family member and their own right and their own needs and their own need for support. So we're desperately keen that anybody who's coming across family members thinks about Scottish Families, just puts them towards our helpline or refers them directly with their permission, and then we can do everything else. It should be seen as a kind of help to all these other services, that a GP doesn't really need to worry about a family member. They just need to remember to refer them on to us, and then we'll do everything else to support that family member in their own right.
Because at that point, it's not a practical, it's not a mental health or a health issue that the GP is dealing with. It's like, no, they're looking for practical support and advice and knowledge from a team of people that can give that, I guess. And yeah, like you say, the GP doesn't need to know all that. It's just a case of being able to see the signs and be able to refer. Sorry, Chris.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's actually quite strong as well, the message where you've kind of went out and said, you've taken as a journey, you've kind of explained the dark side of it. You've mentioned bereavement, you've mentioned suicide, we've mentioned Naloxone.
Naloxone, you're nearly there.
Nearly there.
Naloxone, is it Naloxone?
Naloxone.
Chris, I don't know what you're saying, Chris, but
I can't get it.
All these extra syllables in it.
We spoke around that side, but then we spoke around the kind of medium side and even the lighter side, and even it's around your perception and relationship with alcohol and drugs. So you mentioned, which for me has been quite a key point, which I keep on thinking about, is whenever a child can't distinguish between whether or not you're tipsy or drunk, they just see it's alcohol. So when you open the fridge, there's daddy's beers in there, there's mummy's wine, whatever like that. So even though people might be listening to this, they aren't actually a habitual user of substance or whatever else, but they've got a relationship with alcohol. It's having that mindset of what is impact that's going to have in your family and your kids growing up, because is it become a socially accepted thing to have it in the house, and they'll maybe have a sip of your beer or something like that, have a bit of a laugh. So it's changing that mindset and thinking about, well, what would that mean to them when they're older? Because we can reflect back in the 80s. I remember my dad's 40th way back in the early 90s, and my cousin's getting me drunk, and I was like only a wee boy at that point. But then it didn't, and it seems to have got a bit more normal and normalized. So I think it's just trying to not even break that stigma, but just making people a bit more conscious about their decisions in life as well.
Exactly, and also how we're playing into that. So not just always thinking about children, but with our own friendships, with our own networks. There might be people who are concerned about their own drinking or drug use, and actually just opening the door to enabling them to speak about that in an open way, to seek help if they're looking for help, and also to give them other options. Like if they want to go to an alcohol-free space, make sure you can do that. Don't always have alcohol or drugs at everything that people go to.
Yeah, I think that is, or I'm so passionate about that, and it frustrates me so much with my own mates that everything, guys, me and my mates, and this is going to sound sexist, but I do think there's a gender difference here, where I see my wife going out and meeting her friends for a coffee or going for a walk and stuff, and yet me and my mates, one, we can't organise anything to even get together, but it has to revolve around a piss up. It has to revolve around
I'll keep a
beers.
diplomatic silence on that.
Yeah, and it's just a frustration one. But I love the idea, just go for a coffee, try and find some alternatives, golf, sport, try and find something that's recreational, that's maybe going to benefit in terms of that social interaction, but not without the downside and the hangover or whatever else. And I know that's at a mild level, but it's definitely a frustration that I see.
It's interesting what you were saying about gender, though, because a lot of the marketing around alcohol is very much targeted at women. And my colleague, Professor Carol Emsley at Glasgow Caledonian University, has run a campaign called Don't Pink My Drink, if you look for that in social media. Yeah. And people are posting images of marketing which is clearly targeted at women, the kind of mummy's wine, it's gin o'clock. And see if you try and buy like a Mother's Day card, a birthday card for a female friend, it is unbelievable how many of them are alcohol themed. So that's what I mean about thinking about not just always thinking about children, but how are we as adults also kind of fueling this sort of industry through what we are doing ourselves as well. And just again, as I said, being mindful about, it's an absolute torture for me trying to find a card, because you're just like, can't buy that one, can't buy that one. You know, it really makes you think differently about the way we've all bought into this. We all have, you know, and it just, you have to be a lot more creative if you don't buy into it.
Yeah. No, I've absolutely loved the conversation, Justina. I think, you know, we had on the first season of the podcast, we had Kirsty Mulcahy, who runs Sober Buzz over in Edinburgh, and we had a good conversation with her. Great personality. Both Chris and I don't think off the back of that, but we've had kind of sober periods where we've done that and proactively kind of promoted that through the podcast. But whether you're planning on going, you know, sober, or whether you feel that you've got an issue, I guess the first thing is kind of reach out to yourselves, so Scottish Families, and see if it's help for yourself or it's help for your families or your loved ones. I think reach out and have that conversation first and foremost. It's not about, you're not going to turn around, nothing in this conversation's led me to believe you're going to turn around and say, you must go sober, you must do X, Y, Z. It's all about kind of treating individuals and seeing them at face value and giving them a kind of plethora of resources and support to be able to help in their specific situation. So yeah, it's been great to be able to bring you on and talk about it and raise a subject which I think we all think needs to be spoken more about in Scotland.
Yeah, I told you we wouldn't be short of anything to say.
Had no doubt. So if anyone needs to reach you, Justina, are you on social media? We better contact and put in the Scottish Families. We'll put obviously all the website and contact details up there. Take it across Instagram and things like that. Are that the best places to follow? We are across all the platforms. So Scottish Families is across everything. I personally am also on Twitter at CEO SFAD. You can find me there. So yeah, definitely reach out to us on social media, and we'll have a bit of promo. So happy to do that. Good stuff. We'll put something out off the back of recording this as well, and I guess when it goes out as well. But yeah, thanks so much.
It was lovely meeting you. Lovely meeting you.
Yeah, cheers. We'll keep in touch.
As always, thank you so much for listening to the Pop Pod this week. If you'd like to leave a review or share the podcast with others, then that'd be awesome. You'll find us on Instagram at the Pop Pod, and on Facebook we have a community group called Purpose to Progress that anyone can join. And we'll be back every Monday with a new episode, but until then, stay on purpose and we'll see you next week.